The sun burned low and hard over the Wyoming plains, turning the prairie into a wavering sea of heat and dust. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Wade Cross, a widowed cowboy, dragged his sleeve across a sweat-stung brow as he studied the brittle grass and cracked earth of his ranch. The lonely quiet of the cabin behind him pressed like a weight, a sharp reminder of the life he'd lost 3 years back when fever carried off his beloved Martha. At 35, Wade wasn't chasing romance. He'd written to a mail-order agency for pure necessity, someone plain sturdy and steady enough to help keep the place running. Love had no place in the careful emptiness he'd built for himself. The letter in his pocket felt heavy as he rode toward Whetstone Ridge, the dusty town that served the far-flung ranches of the territory. Wade tipped his hat briefly to Marshall Boone Tate, outside the jailhouse, careful to avoid the watchful eyes of Mabel Dunn at her general store. 2 weeks had passed since he'd sent his request for a bride of sensible age and simple looks. Today the stagecoach was due, and with it he hoped a practical partner. Instead, what stepped down from the coach would change his nights forever. A young woman in a modest bonnet met his gaze, with eyes as blue and steady as the mountain sky. Josie Gale carried herself with quiet grace, the kind of beauty that made Wade's pulse kick hard in his chest. He cleared his throat and reached out a calloused hand, suddenly aware of its roughness. "Miss Gale, I presume?" He said, his voice gravelly, betraying the jolt that still rattled him. This woman was nothing like the plain, work-worn helpmate he'd pictured. Josie's gloved hand met his with a firmness that surprised him. "Miss Gale, indeed," she answered. "The agency told me you were looking for a bride, not merely a housekeeper." Her polished eastern accent rang oddly against the dry wind of Whetstone Ridge. The handful of townsfolk waiting at the depot fell silent, watching the pair with open curiosity. Wade felt their stares like a physical prod, especially the lingering look from Eli Briggs, the blacksmith whose appreciative glance toward Josie sparked a sharp, unexpected irritation. "Your belongings?" Wade asked, nodding to a single trunk smaller than he'd expected for a woman who had crossed half a continent. Either she traveled light by nature, or she'd left in a hurry. "This is all I need for a new life," she replied, her calm tone carrying layers of meaning he couldn't quite read. The stage driver doffed his hat with a grin. "A pleasure, Miss Gale. Fine to have such smart conversation on a long run." The man's easy familiarity set Wade's jaw tight. The ride to the ranch stretched quiet and uneasy, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and the distant cry of hawks. More than once he caught himself watching Josie's profile as she studied the stark land with genuine interest. "There's a rough kind of beauty here," she said at last. "This land makes no false promises. It demands respect." Her words startled him. Few outsiders sensed the hard honesty of this country so quickly. Guiding the wagon around a bend, Wade revealed the sweep of his holdings, 200 acres of wind-scoured grass, a creek shrunk to a trickle, and the modest cabin he had built with his own hands. "It isn't much," he admitted, suddenly seeing it through her eyes. "It's a beginning," Josie said simply, without a trace of disappointment. As they neared the cabin, Wade felt a flicker of dismay. Tools lay scattered on the porch, unwashed dishes sat by the pump, and clothes hung limply on the line. He hadn't thought how his solitary habits would look to someone new. "I'll show you where you'll sleep," he said abruptly, hefting her trunk with ease. The cabin held only 2 rooms, his plain bedroom, and a smaller space once meant for children, but now crowded with winter stores and the few mementos of Martha. Josie stepped inside, composed and steady, despite the roughness that must have shocked a woman raised back east. The floorboards creaked under her boots as she entered what would be her new world. A narrow window faced the sunrise, its glass dusty but letting in soft light. Wade set down the trunk and began clearing crates of supplies. "I'll have it proper by nightfall," he promised, heat creeping up his neck. "May I see the rest?" she asked, neither critical nor timid. He nodded, and she moved through the main room with quiet purpose, noting the stone fireplace, the hand-hewn table and lone chair, the shelves stocked with simple necessities. Her gaze paused on the single decoration, a faded wedding daguerreotype of Martha smiling from another life. Josie asked no questions, but he felt her recognition of the memory that haunted the place. "The pump sticks sometimes," Wade said as he led her outside. "Creek's nearly gone, but the well gives enough for now. Outhouse is behind the cottonwood." She studied the homestead with a keen eye. "The beans need water, and that roof will need patching before winter sets in." Her plain-spoken assessment was sharp, but free of scolding just fact. As dusk spread its long shadows across the land, Wade grew aware of the thin stew waiting on the stove. "I've got rabbit stew for supper," he said awkwardly. "Nothing fancy." "That will do just fine," Josie answered, removing her bonnet to free a wave of chestnut hair pinned neatly at her nape. The simple motion caught him off guard, making her presence in the rough cabin seem both natural and startling. As dusk settled like smoke across the Wyoming range, Wade Cross struck a match and lit the oil lamp. Its amber glow chased the shadows up the log walls, catching the quiet strength in Josie Gale's face. "I should lay things out plain," he began, his voice rougher than he meant. The tidy speech he'd planned suddenly felt clumsy now that she stood before him. "I'm looking for a partner in work, not a wife in the romantic sense," Wade said, flatly ladling rabbit stew into two mismatched bowls. "Someone to help with the stock, the land, the chores that stack up when a man's on his own." The words sounded harder in the hushed cabin than they had on paper. Josie accepted the bowl with a small nod, her expression calm and unreadable in the lamplight. "And children?" she asked, without hesitation. The question seemed to thrum in the air between them, unavoidable. Wade's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. The image of laughter echoing through these empty rooms struck him like a memory from another lifetime, both sweet and unsettling. "I hadn't thought that far," he admitted, feeling old emotions stir beneath his plain practicality. After supper, Josie quietly rolled up her sleeves and set to washing the dishes. The sight of her slender arms working the soap into the cast iron pulled Wade back to a home life long gone. When they sat again, she straightened with resolve. "We should be clear on a few points," she said. "I'll cook, clean, tend the garden, and learn whatever ranch chores you see fit, but I have conditions of my own." He blinked, more intrigued than annoyed. "Name 'em. I'll take your name and keep your house," she said, meeting his eyes. "But I'll need time before sharing your bed, and I want a small allowance from the ranch's profits money that's mine to save or spend as I choose." Heat climbed Wade's neck at her frankness, yet her second demand piqued his curiosity. "What would you need your own money for out here?" He gestured toward the wide, empty land beyond the door. "Independence is worth something, Mr. Cross," Josie replied, her voice firm. "I didn't ride this far just to be somebody's property." There was a flicker, fear, maybe steel in her eyes, hinting at a past she wasn't ready to share. Wade nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Judge Hank Rourke will be riding circuit next week. We'll have him marry us then." Morning broke bright and sharp. Wade woke to the sound of soft movement in his kitchen. Josie had risen early, hair neatly braided, coaxing fire from the stove. "I found your coffee beans," she said, with a hint of amusement. They were stored wrong, moisture would ruin them. I moved them to a sealed jar. He watched her move through the kitchen with natural ease, setting things to rights, as if she'd been there all along. Her confident touch clashed intriguingly with the refinement of her Eastern speech. After breakfast, he showed her the struggling garden where beans, corn, and potatoes fought the dry soil. "The drought's been cruel," he said. "If rain doesn't come soon, we'll lose most of it." Josie knelt, skirts tucked aside, loosening the hard-packed earth with careful fingers. "These roots can't breathe. You need raised mounds to catch every drop of moisture." Her sure grasp of farming left him momentarily speechless. "Where'd a city woman learn that my father believed a woman should study more than etiquette?" she said, a quick shadow crossing her face before she regained her composed look. "Botany was part of my schooling." They worked side by side through the hot morning, reshaping the beds. Josie never once complained of the heat. By noon, the garden bore fresh promise. She straightened, wiping sweat, and leaving a streak of earth on her cheek without the polished edges of her arrival. She looked even more alive, real in a way that drew him. "You should see the rest of the place," Wade said, uneasy, with the sudden tug in his chest. He led her beyond the empty corral to the creek bed, explaining how he meant to divert water once the rains returned. At the far edge of his spread, a half-built frame stood silent. "Supposed to be a barn?" he said with a trace of embarrassment. Other chores got in the way. 3 days passed in steady rhythm, shared work, and careful space. On the 4th morning, Wade hitched the wagon. "We need supplies in town," he told her, noticing the spark in her eyes, at the chance to leave the ranch for a spell. They rode toward Whetstone Ridge, mostly in companionable silence, Josie breaking it now and then with remarks about wild plants or questions about distant landmarks. Her fascination with the wide country felt genuine, her wonder at its raw beauty echoing Wade's own. Whetstone Ridge was little more than a single dusty street, lined with a handful of weather-beaten buildings, a general store blacksmith saloon, a modest church, and the solid 2-story frame that housed Marshal Boone Tate's office, and the small courtroom where Judge Hank Rourke held sessions on his quarterly rounds. Conversations died down as Wade helped Josie Gale step from the wagon. News in a place like this traveled faster than prairie fire, and folks had plainly been speculating about the stranger bound for Wade's ranch. Behind the counter stood Mabel Dunn, sharp-eyed and unashamed of her curiosity. "So this is her," she said, skipping any proper welcome, while her gaze swept over Josie from bonnet to boots. Josie offered her hand with quiet grace. "Miss Gale, soon to be Mrs. Cross. I'm pleased to meet you, Mrs. Dunn." Mabel's eyes narrowed at the refined cadence of Josie's voice, feeding whatever gossip she'd been nursing. "Not every day a lady of your polish answers a rancher's ad," she said, her tone carrying more bite than warmth. Wade stiffened at the slight to both his homestead and Josie's character, but before he could speak, Josie replied evenly, "I'd rather build an honest life than sit idle in comfort that means nothing." As they gathered supplies, Wade caught the low buzz of whispers trailing them through the store. Speculation on why an educated beauty would choose a widowed cowboy known for his solitary ways and plain manners. Across the street, Eli Briggs gave his apprentice a light cuff when the boy nearly scorched his hand at the forge from staring too openly. Cross, Eli called, wiping his hands on a leather apron as he came over. "Heard you've got yourself a new—" Mrs. Wade gave a curt nod. "Miss Gale and I will wed when Judge Rourke rides through." The words came out more possessive than he'd intended. "Lucky man," Eli said with a half smile, his appreciative glance lingering a beat too long on Josie. It set Wade's jaw tight. While Wade settled the account with Mabel, Josie wandered to a corner shelf, where a small shipment of books from back east had been displayed. Her fingers lingered on a slim volume of Whitman's poetry, as though greeting an old companion. "You read!" Whitman came a deep voice behind her. Startled, she turned to see Marshal Boone Tate, tall and quiet as a stalking cougar. Unlike the others, his look carried more inquiry than judgment. "I find his praise of America's untamed spirit well suited to this land," Josie replied, her tone both learned and unpretentious. The marshal studied her a long moment. "Strange winds carry all manner of souls to Whetstone Ridge," he said at last. "Some settle, some drift on, and some bring trouble with them." The subtle warning hung in the still air as they finished loading their goods. On the ride home, Josie stayed uncommonly quiet, her gaze often sliding to the trail behind, as if expecting someone or something to appear. Wade wanted to ask what shadowed her thoughts, but found no words that fit. By the time they topped the hill overlooking the ranch, the sinking sun washed the small homestead in a molten glow, lending it a fleeting grandeur. "Not quite what you're accustomed to," Wade said, the edge in his own voice surprising him. The day's idle talk had worked its way under his skin. Josie turned toward him, dusk softening her features. "What I'm used to and what I truly need are two very different things, Mr. Cross. Maybe that's true for both of us." The following week brought no mercy from the dry skies. Wade rose before dawn to find Josie already outside, her figure framed against a red-gold sunrise, studying the struggling plants. "We need a proper channel from the well to the garden," she said, without preamble. Her mind was already set on solutions, while others might have yielded to the drought. "If we adapt the old creek bed, we can guide water where it's needed most." By mid-morning, they were streaked with dust and sweat, digging narrow trenches under Josie's keen direction. As she explained gravity flow and ways to conserve every drop, Wade's respect for her deepened with each shovelful. Hard work had peeled away the last traces of Eastern gentility, revealing a woman of grit and uncommon strength. Beneath her polished manners beat the heart of a woman built for hard country. Josie Gale's once smooth hands now carried raw blisters wrapped in bits of cloth she never mentioned. When Wade Cross caught her with hair loose and sleeves dusty, she only said, "Back east folks fret over appearances. Out here staying alive is what counts. It's an honest trade I prefer." By sunset, they had finished a rough but clever irrigation channel, guiding precious well water straight to the thirsty roots. Josie stepped back with quiet pride as the first trickle gurgled through the trenches. That night, the silence over supper had turned companionable. Wade found himself really talking about the ranch and the plans he'd long ago buried with Martha. Josie listened, ladling him a second helping of rabbit stew, brightened with wild herbs she'd found by the creek. "You've got a keen feel for this land," she said. "You see possibilities most men would miss." Her simple faith unlocked something tight in his chest. Later, under a moonlit sky spilling silver through the cabin window, he realized he'd spoken more words in one day than in the last month combined. Judge Hank Rourke was expected in 2 days, an unspoken fact that hovered in the air as they retired to their separate rooms. The thought of binding vows should have brought relief. Instead, it stirred an unease he couldn't name. At dawn, clouds gathered heavy in the west clouds the parched earth had prayed for. Josie stood on the porch, watching the dark thunderheads roll closer, wonder softening her face. "My father always said rain on a wedding day brings good luck," she murmured, offering the first glimpse of her past. All day they worked in sync, shoring up the roof, clearing drainage, covering the fresh garden rows. Words were scarce. They didn't need them. The storm hit after nightfall, lightning cracking the plains wide open and thunder rattling the stout cabin. Josie watched spellbound each flash, etching her profile in silver. "In the city storms only spoil plans," she whispered. "Here they mean life itself." Wade found his eyes tracing the gentle line of her cheek, the soft lift of her lips, noticing more than he meant to. Rain hammered the roof, a fierce music that almost drowned her quick laugh when a bolt struck nearby and made them both jump. The shared startle dissolved the last formality between them. "Never thought I'd bless a leaky roof," Wade said as he set buckets beneath the drips. The simple chore felt different now, full of purpose with her beside him. They lingered by the fire, listening as the storm eased into steady rain. Wade spoke of Martha, of the joy before the fever, took her memories he hadn't voiced in years. Josie listened without interrupting, eyes reflecting firelight and a depth of understanding that spoke of her own quiet losses. When she finally spoke, her voice held a calm wisdom. "Grief hollows a space in us. Someday we get to choose what fills it again." Rain kept on through the night, and something subtle shifted between them, a trust deeper than mere necessity. By the next afternoon, Judge Rourke's buggy cut through the mud to their door. The seasoned judge blinked at Josie's composed beauty, his glance flicking between them with undisguised curiosity at their unusual match. The ceremony inside the main room lasted barely 5 minutes, plain words of commitment, while Rain tapped a steady hymn on the roof. No rings, no sweet speeches, just vows of loyalty and shared labor. Wade noticed Josie's hand tremble only slightly as she signed her elegant script, another quiet revelation. When the judge left, silence settled in the cabin. The marriage certificate lay on the table, the ink still wet. Josie broke the stillness first. "I should check the irrigation channels," she said, grasping for the safety of work. "Good idea," Wade agreed, just as eager to trade uncertain feelings for the steadiness of physical labor. Outside, the land already smelled of renewal. Tender green shoots pushed through soil that yesterday had been dust. That evening they sat together on the porch, watching distant lightning dance along the horizon. Josie had turned their humble stores into a meal that felt in its quiet way like a true celebration of the life they were beginning. "To new beginnings," Wade Cross said at last, lifting his dented tin cup of coffee in a rough-hewn toast. The words felt thin for the weight of the day, yet he meant every syllable. "To new beginnings." Josie Gale echoed softly, her eyes fixed on the far-off storm instead of his. A quiet beat of peace hung between them until the sharp rhythm of hoofbeats broke the night. Wade was on his feet, in a breath hand sliding to the rifle by the door. Every nerve tightened, the old frontier instinct to guard what was his sparking to life. An owl's lonely cry cut through the dark, eerie and fitting, while the barn rafters seemed to watch with their own silent judgment. Josie stepped beside him, her grip steady on his arm. She wasn't hiding behind him. She was standing with him, every inch the partner she'd promised to be. The moon slipped behind a racing cloud, and shadows leapt across the porch, doubling the number of phantom riders in Wade's imagination. The boards under their feet groaned as if sensing the moment's weight. The scent of rain-wet earth filled his lungs. Even the insects had gone silent, as though the prairie itself held its breath. A memory flickered Martha's final night, sharpening his resolve. Loss had once left him hollow, but now it forged his will to protect. Beside him, Josie's breathing steadied, the same unyielding focus she'd shown when carving irrigation channels, now fixed on whatever approached. Wade's rifle caught a silver gleam of moonlight. The weapon felt cool and certain in his hands, the old code of the West whispering in his mind, "Stand your ground, guard your own." Slowly, a single rider's outline pulled free from the darkness. Relief flickered when he recognized the broad-brimmed hat of Marshal Boone Tate. Though relief carried its own unease, visits at this hour seldom meant simple news. Then Wade felt Josie stiffen. The cup slipped from her grasp and shattered on the porch. "He's found me," she breathed, voice hollow. The rider emerged, rain dripping from his hat brim. Crossboone greeted with a curt nod before his eyes shifted to Josie. "Mrs. Cross my congratulations." Wade stepped subtly forward, shielding her without thought. "What brings you out on a night like this? Martial trouble in town?" Boone's weathered face was unreadable as he held out a folded telegram. "Came through the wire from Boston. Figured it couldn't wait." Josie's hands trembled as she opened the paper. Each line drained color from her face until she looked carved from stone. "Who is Cyrus Flint Boone?" asked evenly. "That name's all over the message. Seems a man's been sending inquiries about a woman matching your description clear from Boston westward." The name struck Josie like a blow. She swayed, catching the porch rail for support. "My former fiancé," she whispered. "My father pledged me to him before he died." A hard anger surged through Wade at the fear in her eyes. "She's my wife now." He said the words sharp and certain, surprising even himself with their force. "Whatever deal existed back east is finished." Boone's gaze stayed cool, but held a flicker of warning. "Might not be that simple if this Flint claims you left with family property or if there's a contract he can wave around. A rich man's trouble has a way of spreading." When the marshal finally rode off, Josie remained by the hearth, the telegram crushed tight in her fist. "I should have told you," she said, tears finally breaking free. "I came west not only to marry but to escape. Cyrus Flint controls half the shipping trade in Boston. My father's gambling debts left me as the price of his rescue, a business deal dressed up as a wedding promise." Wade guided her gently to a chair and poured a small measure of the whiskey he kept for hard times. The fire caught amber light in the cup, and on the plain gold band he'd bought for her simple, honest, and somehow stronger than any jeweled ring. "He's not the kind of man who lets go of what he calls his property," Josie Gale said quietly, a shiver running through her at memories she left unspoken. The thin scar on her wrist suddenly told a harsher story than Wade Cross had first imagined. Outside, the storm thrashed and growled, echoing the turmoil inside. Josie laid out the whole truth. Cyrus Flint's jealous grip, his reach through Boston's merchant world, and the desperate night she fled with only what she could carry, selling her mother's last heirlooms to buy a westbound ticket. The matrimonial agency had seemed the perfect disguise, a respectable reason to vanish a new name, a clean slate beyond Flint's grasp. Her practical plan wasn't so different from Wade's own choice to seek a mail-order bride. Two different desperations had met and oddly fit. By dawn, the rain had passed, leaving slick mud paths and the clean scent of wet earth. Despite the shadow of danger, Josie insisted they keep working the garden, finding comfort in labor. Wade understood deep in his bones. 3 days slipped by with no fresh news from town each sunset. A brief relief. Each sunrise, another day on alert. Their shared watchfulness drew them closer, softening boundaries. Wade found himself noticing her in new ways, the quiet fire in her eyes, the copper glints in her hair when the sun caught it, the steady courage she carried like a second skin. What began as a plain arrangement was deepening into something neither had planned. Saturday forced another trip to Whetstone Ridge for mail and supplies. Josie refused to stay behind. "I won't live like a prisoner again, not even for safety," she said, chin lifted. The town, still puddled from the recent rain, greeted them with sidelong looks, heavy with gossip about the Boston woman's mysterious past. Eli Briggs stepped out from the blacksmith shop, his easy confidence sharpened by the small crowd watching. "Mrs. Cross," he said with exaggerated charm, "you're looking mighty well for frontier life." Wade noted Eli's trimmed beard and freshly laundered shirt efforts Wade didn't like at all. Josie answered with polite distance, but Eli pressed on. "Town's holding a social after church next weekend. Thought you might welcome a bit of civilized company after being cooped up at Cross's place." Something in Eli's tone tightened Wade's jaw. His hand found the small of Josie's back in a quiet claim. "Plenty of work at the ranch," he said, the words clipped. Josie surprised them both with a bright smile. "A social sounds lovely. We'd be pleased to attend, wouldn't we, husband?" The last word landed like a hammer. Eli's smile slipped just for a heartbeat. Inside Mabel Dunn's store, the owner's pinched face hinted she'd overheard every word. "Interesting telegram came for you yesterday, Mrs. Cross. From Boston, no less," she said, savoring each syllable. "How curious," Josie replied lightly, her pleasant voice belying the steel in her eyes. "I wasn't expecting any letters." The answer revealed nothing while confirming everything to Mabel's busy mind. With their purchases packed, Wade and Josie were heading out when Marshal Boone Tate crossed from his office, his stride deliberate expression unreadable. He lowered his voice. "News from the territorial marshal about your Boston man," he said. "Seems Flint's offering a rich reward for word on his runaway fiancée might be coming himself." The ride home unfolded in tense silence. The land's wide beauty now bristled with unseen menace. Wade's eyes kept sweeping the horizon, one hand resting near his rifle as they rolled along the exposed trail. By evening, clouds thickened again. They secured every latch and shutter checking weapons until Wade could nearly field strip the rifle blind. The motions gave little comfort. "I won't let him take you back," he said finally, the quiet certainty startling them both. The words lingered in the fire-lit room, heavy with meaning neither dared unpack. Josie met his gaze, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Why risk yourself for someone who's brought trouble to your door? You're no stranger anymore," Wade said simply. The truth, needing no polish. Thunder grumbled far off as Josie turned to wash the dishes, each careful movement buying her a moment to breathe. The simple act felt almost unreal against the weight of what lay ahead. Then the storm struck wind, howling rain flung sideways, lightning carving wild streaks across the sky. A sudden crash told of a roof plank ripped from the storage shed. "We've got to secure what we can," Wade shouted over the roar, yanking on his coat and hat. Without a heartbeat's hesitation, Josie plunged into the gale beside him, proving again she had no intention of being sheltered from the fight. Rain slammed down in sheets as Wade Cross and Josie Gale fought to save what they could, dragging supplies toward the sturdier shelter of the barn, while gusts threatened to peel the rest of the roof away. A deafening crack of thunder sent the horses into frenzy, kicking and rearing against their stalls. Josie darted forward without hesitation, her calm voice somehow piercing the roar of the storm. "Easy now, easy," she soothed, laying gentle hands on their heaving flanks, until the frightened animals steadied. Lightning splintered the night, throwing her determined face into sharp relief. "This isn't the Boston lady who stepped off that stagecoach," Wade thought, shouting over the gale. "We'll wait it out here. The cabin's too far." The heavy timber barn offered safer refuge than the open stretch between buildings. When at last they dropped onto a mound of hay drenched to the bone, the furious energy that had driven them gave way to breathless quiet. Josie swept wet hair from her brow and laughed, clear, bright, and utterly free. "I've never felt so alive," she said, eyes shining. "Back east everything is neat and caged, even the weather. Out here the world runs wild." Wade watched her spellbound. Rain-glossed cheeks, clothes clinging to her strong frame, every inch of her seemed alive with the untamed spirit of the West. The careful wall he'd built around his heart cracked like the shed roof outside. Without thinking, he reached to brush a soaked strand from her face. His calloused fingers lingered on her cheek, a touch that sparked hotter than the lightning overhead. Josie's breath caught eyes wide before softening with trust. "I never thought I'd find safety with a stranger," she whispered, "or fear losing it more than what I fled." The words bridged the last space between them. Wade drew her close, his kiss gentle but sure. Josie's arms slid around his neck, and the world beyond the barn vanished. When they finally parted, no speech could match the depth of what had shifted. Lantern light swayed above, casting a warm glow that gilded the tears in Josie's eyes like drops of amber. Wade's rough thumb traced the elegant curve of her jaw, marveling at her blend of resilience and grace. Outside, the storm softened thunder, rolling farther away as the downpour eased to steady rain. Nature seemed to recognize the quiet change within them. The air carried the scent of fresh hay and prairie roses mingled with the subtle lavender note that was hers alone, an imprint Wade knew he'd carry forever. They rested forehead to forehead, a wordless vow in the simple meeting of skin. Josie's fingertips explored the lines at the corners of his eyes, reading years of sun loss and hard-won endurance. The distant thunder echoed the tremor in Wade's chest, an old fortress of grief and solitude finally yielding. In the barn's warm dimness, with animals breathing calmly nearby, they understood a truth of frontier life survival demanded more than grit. It called for connection. The land might strip a person bare, yet it granted rare gifts to those who stood together. Rain kept a steady rhythm on the roof, a cocoon of sound around their fragile, newfound closeness. Josie's head rested on Wade's shoulder as his arm drew her in, protective and sure. After a long silence, she finally asked, her voice barely above the patter of rain, "What happens when he comes?" The question hung in the barn's hush, fragile as the peace they'd just found. The threat of Cyrus Flint couldn't be wished away with rain or tenderness. Wade Cross's reply came steady and sure, free of the caution that had once ruled his life. Then he learns a hard truth. Some things can't be bought or claimed. They have to be given. Morning light filtered through the barn's old boards, touching Wade and Josie Gale, where they rested in the hay, still leaning into each other. The storm had rolled east, leaving puddles and fallen branches like markers of what had changed in the night. When Josie's eyes met his, a flush rose in her cheeks. No words were needed. The understanding was plain. What began as a bargain had turned into choice affection forged in a night of fury and quiet resolve. Hand in hand, they walked back to the cabin, surveying broken fences, scattered shingles, and bent irrigation channels. The chores waiting no longer felt daunting. Together, they were manageable. In the days that followed, something subtle but sure shifted. A glance held longer across supper fingertips, grazing when passing tools, low-voiced talks that stretched past midnight. The walls that had kept them apart melted like winter snow, replaced by a closeness neither had thought possible again. By Sunday, they had to decide about the town social. Josie straightened Wade's collar, the familiar gesture quickening his pulse. "We can't hide forever," she said. That evening, Whetstone Ridge gleamed with lanterns strung in the churchyard. Long tables sagged under pies and roasts, children darted between benches, and grown-ups gathered in cheerful knots of talk. Conversation slowed as Wade and Josie entered, hands clasped. Mabel Dunn's eyes narrowed at the sight, her thin smile as stiff as her greeting. The simple blue dress Josie wore, and Wade's easy manner beside her, undercut every rumor Mabel had spun. From the edge of the yard, Marshal Boone Tate tipped a slight nod, both warning and assurance in his steady gaze. Then Eli Briggs strode up bravado bright before the onlookers. "Mrs. Cross, you must share a dance with someone who knows the steps," he said, holding out a hand. Josie stiffened, but before she could refuse, a low rumble rose on the eastern road. Dust plumed as 6 well-kept horses approached. All talk died. Their leader dismounted with a polish foreign to this country. Tailored coat, silk waistcoat, and Boston polish, announced Cyrus Flint before he spoke. "My apologies for breaking up your rustic celebration," he said, each word edged with superiority. "I've come for my fiancée, Josie Gale, misled into leaving Boston under regrettable circumstances." Josie's grip on Wade's hand tightened until it ached, her color draining, as Flint's sharp eyes swept the crowd like a man spotting misplaced property. Marshal Tate moved forward, one hand easy near his holster. "This is a peaceful gathering. Speak your piece or ride on." Flint drew out a folded paper with theatrical care. "A contract," he announced, "signed by her late father, binding her to marry me as payment for large debts. I am here only to reclaim what is rightfully mine." Murmurs stirred uneasily. Western folk valued a man's word, yet bristled at an outsider's arrogance. Flint pressed on smoothly, painting Josie as confused and himself as her benefactor. Then his eyes found her. "There you are, my dear Josie. This misunderstanding ends now. Come, we'll head home." Wade stepped forward, placing himself squarely between them, quiet determination cutting through the stunned silence. "Josie Gale is gone," he said, his voice carrying clear across the yard. "This is Josie Cross, my wife." A hummingbird flashed through a beam of sunlight, pausing on a trumpet flower, as if the world itself held still to witness the moment. The tiny bird's fearless dash through the tense gathering seemed to carry its own message of fragile courage, steadying Josie Gale's resolve. Around them, townsfolk shifted in quiet ripples, some edging closer to Wade Cross, and Josie others drifting toward Cyrus Flint's polished entourage. Without a word spoken, Whetstone Ridge declared where loyalties lay. Mabel Dunn's sharp eyes softened for a breath as she watched Wade stand firm, no longer the withdrawn widower, but a man ready to fight for his wife. She gripped her handkerchief tight, betraying more heart than her gossip ever suggested. Eli Briggs stepped forward too, his blacksmith's frame adding silent weight to Wade's side. "The lady's made her choice plain," he said, surprising Wade with the open show of backing despite their earlier rivalry. A child's stray ball rolled between the two groups, an innocent interruption that briefly broke the spell of confrontation. Overhead, the church bell struck noon, its calm chime marking time's unyielding march, while tension sharpened below. The scent of fried chicken and apple pie meant for the social hung oddly in the charged air, reminders of community life pressing on despite the storm of human conflict. Marshal Boone Tate stood like a stone sentinel, right hand easy near his Colt, left hooked in his belt. His cool eyes sized up Flint's companions' city suits, couldn't hide their gunman stance. For a heartbeat, Flint's mask of charm cracked anger flickering through before he smoothed it back. "A frontier marriage of convenience can't outweigh a signed contract," he said crisply. "This agreement with her late father predates whatever hasty vows she's taken." From the crowd emerged Judge Hank Rourke, his steady presence pulling the tension to order. "This belongs in my office," he declared. "We'll examine the papers properly and not spoil a community gathering." Soon, the cramped room above the general store overflowed. Wade and Josie sat across from Flint and his lawyer while Boone Tate kept guard and curious townsfolk pressed to the windows. Papers spread across the scarred desk, one a fresh Wyoming marriage certificate, the other a Boston contract, thick with lawyerly flourish. Judge Rourke inspected both. "This marriage stands under Wyoming law," he said, brow furrowing as he turned to the ornate contract. Josie found her voice steady despite Flint's cold stare. "I never agreed to any such arrangement. My father's signature was taken when he was gravely ill, barely conscious." Flint's cultured laugh dripped disdain. Gentlemen women are often spared the burden of such details. Her father simply secured her future. Wade's rough hand closed over Josie's beneath the table, a quiet anchor as she pressed on. "No debt allows a man to sell his daughter. No paper can force a marriage against my will." Arguments flew as shadows lengthened. Territorial law clashed with Eastern precedent, while Flint's lawyer argued for enforcement. At last, Judge Rourke removed his spectacles and rubbed tired eyes. "Until the Territorial Court meets next month in Cheyenne, Mrs. Cross remains lawfully wed under Wyoming law. Beyond that, the decision is not mine to make. It was reprieve, not final victory." Outside Whetstone Ridge murmured in divided clusters, some swayed by Flint's money, already flowing into saloon and store, others holding fast to frontier justice. Flint's departing smile cut sharp. "Enjoy your brief arrangement, Mr. Cross. The court will favor law over sentiment." The ride home unfolded in grim silence. Josie's earlier calm was frayed by the legal snare. "He never loses," she whispered as their cabin came into view. "His wealth buys whatever verdict he wants." Sunset poured warm gold over the homestead, a cruel contrast to the cold worry settling over them. Wade barred windows, checked cartridges, and set lanterns to erase hiding places. Josie moved through chores like a sleepwalker, her thoughts miles away. The joy they'd found during the storm felt suddenly breakable. "He'll come tonight," she said quietly as full dark fell. "Not in daylight that risks the courts. He'll send men to drag me off and make it look as if I went willingly." Wade worked the action on his rifle with a final deliberate click. "Then we'll be waiting. This isn't Boston. Out here a man stands guard over what's his paper or no paper." The night stretched long and watchful. Every creak of timber, every whisper of wind seemed magnified. Taking turns at the window, they kept vigil side by side, a team forged by love and danger. Near midnight, Josie stiffened, leaning close to the glass, her voice a breath of air. "Riders on the East Ridge. No lamps." Josie Gale breathed, her voice barely a wisp in the dark. The lack of light confirmed it. Whoever came wasn't arriving for a neighborly visit. Inside the cabin, the old clock, once part of Wade's first wife Martha's family, ticked on with steady defiance. Each click stretched into a lifetime as they waited the sound both anchor and reminder that every passing second could shape their future. Moonlight turned common objects into weapons, a cast iron skillet, a heavy rolling pin, even the brass letter opener Josie had brought west. She gathered them with quiet efficiency movements, sure, and practiced. This was not the panic of someone new to danger, but the calm readiness of a woman who had fled trouble before. Outside, the horses caught the scent first, their uneasy whinnies and restless stomps giving nature's own warning. Wade's mind marked every sign, even promising the animals an extra ration if they pulled through the night. Josie doused the final lamp until the cabin surrendered to starlit darkness. Shadows sharpened their senses, the tang of gun oil on Wade's Winchester, the metallic taste of tension on the tongue, the rise and fall of their joined breath. A lone coyote's mournful cry drifted across the flats, echoing the fear and defiance neither dared speak aloud. Beneath a loose floorboard lay the marriage papers and property deed Josie had insisted they hide weeks ago. Her foresight now felt prophetic. Wade's Winchester 73 rested easily in his hands, the walnut stock polished by years of frontier living. It was more than a weapon. It was the hard-earned proof that he had survived and would again. Then came the faint, leather-on-leather whisper of men dismounting. Josie's hand slid into Wade's, their grip saying everything words could not. Whatever came, they would meet it side by side. "Wake me if anything changes," Wade murmured, passing her a revolver before slipping out the back door. Years on the range lent his movements the silence of a stalking predator. The moon broke free of clouds silvering the prairie just as 5 riders crept toward the house. Their careful formation and drawn guns spoke of hired men, not weary travelers. Wade's first shot spat dirt in front of the lead horse, sending the beast rearing. "The next one won't miss." His voice rang out like a hammer blow. "This land is defended." For a taut instant, no one moved trained gun hands, measuring a man who knew every inch of the ground beneath them. The lead rider finally called frustration in his even tone. "Mr. Flint won't like this." Wade's answer was steady as granite. "Cyrus Flint's pleasure ain't my concern. This is Wyoming, not Boston. Different rules out here." Before the standoff could snap, a new voice cut through the night. "Federal law stands in every territory. Drop those irons or face arrest." Marshal Boone Tate strode in with 3 hastily deputized townsmen, lantern light glinting on their badges and rifles. The stars overhead burned cold and eternal silent witnesses to yet another human reckoning on this raw frontier. Horses sidestepped and snorted, sensing how thin the line was between order and bloodshed. Dew silvered the grass, a quiet sign of renewal under a sky vast enough to swallow the night's violence. Boone's men, an apprentice smith, a storekeeper's boy, a grizzled neighboring rancher, held firm behind their marshal. They were ordinary folks, standing for justice over the eastern money Flint had scattered like bait. The lead gunman's hand hovered near his holster, then faltered. He wasn't paid enough to die for someone else's obsession. Through it all, Wade kept his rifle steady. Every breath measured every nerve alive. Behind him, Josie stepped into the doorway, outlined by moonlight. She did not cower. Her upright figure, calm and unyielding, drew even the hired gun's respect. The woman who had first stepped off the stage in search of safety now stood unshaken, a living vow that she would never again be treated as property. The night air carried the clean, sharp scent of sage and juniper, the very breath of the Wyoming range, as if the land itself bore witness to the showdown. Those same hardy plants had survived drought's fire and the brutal lash of winter proof that only those who refused to yield could truly belong here. It was the very lesson Wade Cross and Josie Gale had lived. Between Wade's hidden vantage and Marshal Boone Tate's sudden arrival, the hired riders chose the only course that didn't end in blood. Smoothly, like men who'd done this dance before they slid their pistols back into their holsters, their leader tipped his hat toward the marshal with a soldier's respect. "This changes nothing," he said flatly. "Cyrus Flint has reach well beyond this patch of prairie. Whether it's tonight, next week, or after the territorial court rules, he means to see the lady back in Boston." At first light, the raiders melted into the horizon, leaving behind a land washed in soft rose and gold. The peaceful dawn felt almost cruel after the long night of danger. Josie stood in the doorway, her knuckles white around the revolver, a mix of relief and grim resolve in her eyes. Boone accepted a steaming cup of coffee, his weathered face giving away little as he listened. His words, though, carried weight. Flint's rented rooms at the hotel, passing himself off as a respectable investor. He's talking railroads and new stores, making folks dream of easy money. It's buying him quiet support faster than I can count it. Wade's jaw tightened. Josie's earlier warning was proving dead right. Flint's wealth was already sowing division, tempting good people with promises of progress. Frontier independence had its price when pitted against Eastern capital. "We can't win this in a courthouse alone," Josie said, her Boston-bred insight as steady as her voice. "Flint controls lawyers and judges the way he buys ships and men. He's stacked every deck before we even sit down to play." Boone left with a promise to keep watch, but the set of his shoulders betrayed how little faith he had in the law's reach against a man with Flint's resources. Justice on paper could be bought. Justice in the open air would have to be made. Morning sun caught a new resolve in Josie's face. "There's another path," she said, unrolling a map and tracing westward trails with a sure finger. "Idaho, Oregon, places where Boston money means nothing. We could leave tonight, change our names if need be, start clean." Wade studied her carefully. He saw the bravery it took to offer leaving everything behind the ranch they'd worked, the fragile new life they'd built just to keep their freedom. But when he spoke, his answer was solid as bedrock. No. Running lets him win without firing a shot. There's a better way beat him at his own game. Josie understood at once. "You mean challenge him where it hurts most, his reputation, the fine image he's selling to the very people he wants to impress." The next morning, Whetstone Ridge bustled like a fairground. Flint's money had already stirred the town to life. Talk of rail lines and shops hummed in every doorway. The man himself lounged before the hotel, a circle of eager listeners hanging on each gilded promise. Wade stepped into their midst, the quiet authority of a man with nothing to hide pulling every eye. "Mr. Flint," he said evenly, "seems we have unfinished business concerning my wife." Flint's polished smile stayed fixed, but steel flickered in his gaze. "Indeed we do, Mr. Cross. The territorial court will decide soon enough." "Why wait on far-off judges?" Wade's voice carried down the boardwalk. "This town's always settled its own disputes. Folks here deserve to know the truth about the man buying their future." The challenge hung like thunderclouds over the crowd. To ignore it would look like fear. To accept meant ceding control. Flint hesitated a fraction too long. Wade pressed. "Let's bring it before Judge Hank Rourke, right here. Lay every contract and claim on the table in full daylight and let the people of Whetstone Ridge hear what you call justice." A stir of approval rolled through the onlookers' frontier sense, favored straight talk over distant courts. Even those dazzled by Flint's investment talk nodded. A quick public reckoning promised clarity no Boston lawyer could twist. Flint's elegant smile thinned to a blade. He saw the snare refuse and look guilty, agree and lose the script he'd written. Either way, his easy hold on the town had just begun to slip. 2 hours later, the townsfolk packed the little church until every pew and patch of wall space was filled. Judge Hank Rourke called the gathering to order with the steady voice of frontier law. "Both sides will speak their piece," he said. "Evidence will be laid out for all to see, and Whetstone Ridge will render a judgment that stands." Word of the tribunal raced across the prairie, drawing ranchers and homesteaders until nearly every soul in the valley had crowded inside or ringed the windows. Though lacking any formal court seal, the assembly carried the weight of frontier justice and neighborly honor. Cyrus Flint swept in right on time, his silk waistcoat and polished boots aimed to dazzle. Beside him, a slick attorney stacked papers with practiced flair, turning the church lectern into a showpiece for legitimate business. Flint began smoothly, every syllable tuned for persuasion. "Friends, this is about keeping one's word, the very bedrock of civil society. A contract honored is a community secured." His documents painted Josie's late father as a desperate gambler rescued by Flint's benevolence. The marriage contract looked at a glance like a noble solution rather than a trap. A few in the crowd nodded. Debts, after all, were debts. When Josie Gale Rowe's quiet strength replaced Flint's polish with something far more commanding. "That paper may be dressed in proper language," she said evenly, "but it's built on fraud." She told how her father's signature was taken while he lay fevered and barely conscious how Flint arrived, demanding obedience instead of mourning. The room fell silent as she rolled back her sleeve. A faint ring of scar tissue encircled her wrist. "He promised to teach me a lesson," she said, voice carrying to the far door. "To break me like others before." A ripple of outrage stirred the assembly. Wade saw Flint's face twitch, anger flashing before he pasted on a look of wounded innocence. The mask convinced a few, but more eyes began to narrow in doubt. Then Mabel Dunn, the town's sharp-tongued storekeeper, rose, a telegram in hand. "Judge Rourke, I received this yesterday," she said, hesitation warring with conscience. "I held it back because Mr. Flint spends freely. But I can't keep silent. The message from Boston laid bare warrants for Flint's arrest fraud, missing fiancés, families cheated, and left in ruin." A collective murmur rolled through the church like distant thunder. Judge Rourke examined both sets of papers, his face carved from granite. "What's written here?" he said at last. "Proves Cyrus Flint's claim not only void, but criminal. The marriage of Wade Cross and Josie Gale stands legal and binding under Wyoming law." Flint's veneer shattered. Fury blazed across his face as he sputtered threats of appeals and higher courts. But Marshal Boone Tate was already at his side, ready to see those Boston warrants served. By sundown, a trail of dust marked Flint's retreat toward the border. The grand promises he'd used to buy influence dissolved with his disgrace, leaving Whetstone Ridge a little poorer in dreams, but richer in hard truth. "He'll find another hunting ground," Josie said quietly, as she and Wade watched from their porch. There was no fear in her tone, just clear-eyed realism. Wade slipped an arm around her, the gesture no longer just protective, but filled with devotion. But not here. Not ever. Before them, the ranch stretched strong and alive, irrigation channels, brimming new garden rows, thriving the frame of a barn ready to rise. Autumn's first cool breeze felt like a promise, instead of a warning, the land itself acknowledging their hard-won peace. "I never thought love waited out here," Josie whispered, resting her head on Wade's shoulder. "I came only for safety, and found a home." Wade kissed her hair, voice low and certain. "What we think we need, and what truly saves us, are as different as drought and rain, and just as vital for growth." As twilight deepened over the Wyoming plain, their silhouettes blended into one. What began as a practical pact had become the rarest treasure the frontier could give, a love tough enough to outlast every storm. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you.